Okay, let's dive into this. For decades, the international community has grappled with one of the absolute most profound and honestly devastating challenges in human history. What exactly is the world supposed to do when a government begins systematically destroying its own people? Welcome to our explainer on a fundamental yet deeply, deeply controversial pillar of modern global relations. Today we're looking at the UN doctrine known as the responsibility to protect, often just called R2P. We're going to explore this in depth.
Now, to understand why this doctrine even exists, we have to trace a pretty heartbreaking sequence of events. R2P wasn't just created in a vacuum, right? It was born out of profound guilt and staggering international failure. Back in 1994, the world literally watched in horror as roughly 800,000 people were killed in the Rwandan genocide, all while the UN largely just stood by, paralyzed. And then, just 1 year later in 1995, over in Srebrenica, Bosnia, UN peacekeepers actually failed to prevent the massacre of thousands of Muslim men and boys, and this was despite the area being officially designated by the UN as a supposed safe zone. These massive, catastrophic failures exposed a terrifying gap in international law. So as we follow the timeline here to 2005, the world finally responded by adopting the responsibility to protect. But looking ahead to the 2011 Libya intervention, well, as you'll see, adopting a principle and successfully applying it are two very different things.
Section 1. Breaking the Shield. Defining R2P.
So, we know the profound guilt from the 1990s demanded a massive shift in the legal framework. And here's the core definition of that shift. The responsibility to protect is a principle adopted by UN member states back in 2005. It fundamentally states that every single government has a primary duty to protect its own people. But here's the revolutionary part, the second half. If a government cannot or will not do this, or worse, if the government itself is the one committing the atrocities, R2P says the international community has a real responsibility to step in, and they do this acting specifically through the UN Security Council. Now, this intervention isn't just about automatically sending in troops. It's a sliding scale. It empowers the international community to use a whole range of tools. We're talking starting with diplomatic pressure, maybe escalating to economic sanctions, and only in the absolute most extreme cases, authorizing the use of actual military force. And this brilliantly illustrates the strict boundaries of this doctrine, because you might be wondering, what exactly triggers such a massive global response? R2P doesn't just apply to general human rights abuses or everyday political instability. It is laser-focused on four specific, unimaginable horrors: genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. The doctrine is literally designed to be a fail-safe for the absolute worst-case scenarios a population can ever face. It sets a deliberately high bar, ensuring that international intervention is reserved strictly, and I mean strictly, for mass atrocity crimes.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is understanding the friction between the two concepts we have perfectly contrasted here. Over on the left, we've got state sovereignty. The entire UN Charter is actually built around this foundational principle. The idea that what happens inside a country's borders is that country's own business, totally free from outside interference. But then, on the right, we have international intervention under R2P. This argues that the duty to protect human life completely supersedes those invisible borderlines. You see, before 2005, the world had no agreed-upon mechanism for intervening when a state was slaughtering its own population, mostly because sovereignty was treated as absolute. R2P forces a direct, head-on confrontation between these two ideas,
which brings us to this incredibly powerful concept derived directly from the adoption of R2P. Sovereignty is not an absolute shield behind which atrocities can be committed with impunity. This single sentence pretty much captures the entire philosophical revolution of the doctrine. It was specifically designed to close that fatal gap in international law we discussed earlier, declaring definitively that a government's right to govern simply does not include the right to massacre its own citizens without consequence.
Section 2. The fatal flaw. The veto bottleneck.
Now, as brilliant and necessary as the theory of R2P is, its systemic complication lies entirely in enforcement. Remember when we defined R2P, we noted that intervention runs entirely through the UN Security Council? Well, here are the 5 permanent members of that council: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. The problem, and honestly the reason this remains a highly contested live agenda item globally rather than a settled issue, is that each of these 5 powerful states holds veto power. That means the central gate of enforcement can be completely paralyzed at will by any single one of them. For R2P to actually be applied, it requires political convenience for all 5 powers simultaneously. And let's be real, in the complex world of global geopolitics, unanimous agreement among these 5 nations is exceptionally rare. In fact, since the UN's founding, the veto has been used hundreds of times to block resolutions, effectively paralyzing this central gate of enforcement whenever the global powers disagree.
To see how this actually plays out in the real world, we really have to look at the prime example of R2P implementation, the 2011 intervention in Libya. In 2011, R2P was officially invoked by the Security Council to authorize intervention. The stated goal at the time was strictly to protect civilians from mass atrocities. However, that mission mutated. What began as a civilian protection mandate effectively turned into a military campaign that ultimately resulted in the toppling and death of Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi. Now, regardless of where you stand on that, this outcome had massive, unintended geopolitical consequences that absolutely continue to echo through the halls of the UN today.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is understanding the direct fallout of that Libya intervention. Look at the let column here, the skeptics. Ever since 2011, Russia and China have cited the outcome in Libya as proof that R2P is not really about human rights at all, but is simply a legal costume for Western regime change operations. Furthermore, many countries in the global south view the entire doctrine with deep suspicion, seeing it as a tool that powerful states apply selectively against weaker ones while never actually being subject to the same standard themselves. Then, shift your eyes over to the right column, the paralyzed reality. Because of this deep geopolitical suspicion and the mechanics of that veto we talked about, R2P has effectively been locked down. It's been vetoed, blocked, or frankly simply never seriously invoked in devastating modern conflicts like Syria, Yemen, and Myanmar. And this is despite credible, widespread evidence of mass atrocities occurring in each and every one of those places.
Section 3. The Unresolved Paradox. So we are currently caught in a delicate, almost seemingly impossible balance between the moral imperative to stop horrific crimes and the geopolitical imperative to prevent powerful states from intervening wherever they like. So I want to leave you with this final provocative question. How do you fix a system that was built to stop atrocities when its central enforcement gate can be locked shut by any single powerful country acting in its own self-interest? And how do you reform it without simply recreating the exact same problem, where reform just becomes another excuse for powerful states to intervene wherever and however they please? It is perhaps the most vital puzzle in international human rights enforcement today, and the lives of literally millions depend on whether the world can ever find a true answer.